අයිබෝවන් ඔබ දන්නවා රත්මලාන ස්ටයින් මැදිරි සංකීර්ණයේදී 45 වන කැපිටල් මහරජා සමූහයේ වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව මේ මොහොත වන විට පැවැත්වෙනවා. දකුණු අප්‍රිකාවේ හිටපු ජනාධිපතිවරයෙකු වන තාබෝ මැබිකේ මහතාගේ ප්‍රධානත්වයෙන් මේ වන විට උත්සව සභාව සූදානම් ප්‍රධාන ආරාධිතයා ලෙස සහභාගී වන දකුණු අප්‍රිකාවේ හිටපු ජනාධිපතිවරයෙකු සහ කෘතහස්ත දේශපාලඥයෙකු වන තාබෝ මැබිකේ මහතාගේ ප්‍රධාන දේශනයට අපි සූදානම් තවත් සුළු මොහොතකින් එම දේශනයට අවධානය යොමු කරන්න. එනස්ටා
நன்றி மேஷ். கேபிட்டல் மகாராஜா குழுமத்தின் வருடாந்த மாநாடு ரத்மலானி ஸ்டெயின் கலையகத்தில் தற்போது நடைபெற்று வருகின்றது. தென்னாப்பிரிக்காவின் இரண்டாவது ஜனநாயக ஜனாதிபதியும் ஆப்பிரிக்காவின் புகழ்பூத்த அரசியல் தலைவர்களில் ஒருவருமான தாபோ mbeki இந்த மாநாட்டில் பிரதம அதிதியாக கலந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றார். இன்னும் சிறு நொடிகளில் அவர் தனது சிறப்புரை ஆற்றுவதற்காக தயாராகிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றார். கேபிட்டல் மகாராஜா குழுமத்தின் வருடாந்த மாநாட்டிலேயே தாபோ mbeki சிறப்புரையாற்ற இருக்கின்றார். Hashini.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Imesh. The 45th annual convention of the Capital Maharaja Group is currently underway at the Stein Studios, Ratmalana, and the event is graced by the legendary former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, as the chief guest. We will shortly witness the keynote address by the distinguished chief guest of the 45th annual convention of the Capital Maharaja Group, the iconic former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. Now, as the respected successor to the great Nelson Mandela, President Mbeki arrived in Sri Lanka yesterday following a special invitation extended by the Capital Maharaja Group. Let's now turn to his speech.
හතලිස් පස්වන කැපිටල් මහරජා සමූහයේ වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුවයි මේ වන විට ඔබ දකින ආකාරයෙන් පැවැත්වෙන්නේ රත්මලාන ස්ටයින් මැදිරි සංකීර්ණයේදී වාර්ෂිකව කැපිටල් මහරජා සමූහයේ අනුබද්ධ සියලු සමාගම්හි විධායක ශ්‍රේණී නිලධාරීන්ගේ සහභාගීත්වයෙන් තමයි මේ ආකාරයෙන් මෙම වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව පැවැත්වෙන්නේ. මෙවරත් අති උත්කර්ෂවත් අන්දමින් මේ මොහොත වන විට රත්මලාන ස්ටයින් මැදිරි සංකීර්ණයේදී 45 වන වරටත් මෙම වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව පැවැත්වෙනවා. මෙවර අති විශේෂයි මේ සමුළුව. මක්නිසාදයත් අපි කලින් සඳහන් කළ ආකාරයටම දකුණු අප්‍රිකාවේ හිටපු ජනාධිපතිවරයෙකු සහ කෘතහස්ත දේශපාලඥයෙකු වන තාබෝ mbeki මහතාගේ සම්ප්‍රාප්තියත් එක්ක ඔහුගේ සහභාගීත්වයත් සමගයි මෙවර මේ කැපිටල් මහරජා සමූහයේ වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව අති උත්කර්ෂවත් ලෙස පැවැත්වෙන්නේ.
கேபிட்டல் மகாராஜா குழுமத்தின் வருடாந்த மாநாடு தற்போது நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. 45வது வருடாந்த மாநாடு நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. ரத்மலானி ஸ்டைன் கலையகத்தில் வெகு சிறப்பாக நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. தென்னாப்பிரிக்காவின் இரண்டாவது ஜனநாயக ஜனாதிபதியும் ஆப்பிரிக்காவின் புகழ்பூத்த அரசியல் தலைவர்களில் ஒருவரான தாபோ mbeki இந்த மாநாட்டில் சிறப்புரையாற்றுகிறார்.
Should we push it back a bit? Sivan, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. As the chairman, chairperson, and managing director of CMG, Sashirama Rajamahendran, the other distinguished leaders of CMG and distinguished participants at this annual convention of CMG, Your Excellencies, members of the diplomatic corps, and distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, Chairperson, let me say thank you very much indeed for this invitation to attend this convention. Apart from anything else, it enabled me to visit Sri Lanka. This is my very, very first time I'm in this country. And indeed, it's been a very, very good thing that we've been able to attend. In part, Chairperson, to experience this extraordinary show here by these dancers, who did an excellent thing of displaying this level of talent and skill and everything and passion that is there among the people of Sri Lanka. Thanks a lot for that. It's very, very good, very great introduction, including mixing in this performance our own music as South Africans. Thanks a lot indeed for doing that. I must also say, Chairperson, that when Shivan, Daniel, and the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka and South Africa delivered your letter inviting me here, they did a very good thing, which is to give me a bit of a peep into Sri Lanka of today. And the great hope there is among the people of Sri Lanka, as Mr. Daniel has just said, given what has happened in this country, but also a little peep into its challenges. During the course of our struggle, Chairperson, I spent almost 30 years in exile. And we helped to build this, what became a very massive anti-apartheid movement globally. And therefore visited many, many countries. If you asked me which countries of the world I've been to and which ones I have not been to, I think the ones I've not been to would be the minority. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka is one of the countries I didn't visit. And the reason for that, Chairperson, was because of the confidence that we have in the people of Sri Lanka, that really they did not need encouragement in order to join the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. We knew that they would, and they did. But here we are today. I really must also say thanks a lot to CMG for giving us the opportunity yesterday to meet with His Excellency the President, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who received us very gratefully and with great warmth. And indeed, I think from that interaction,
දකුණු අප්‍රිකාවේ හිටපු ජනාධිපතිවරයෙකු සහ කෘතහස්ත දේශපාලනඥයෙකු වන තාබමික මහතා 45 වන කැපිටල් මහරජා සමූහයේ වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව අමතන ආකාරයයි අපි සජීවීව අවධානය යොමු කරේ. ඔබට හැකියාව පවතිනවා ඔහු මෙම වාර්ෂික මහා සමුළුව අමතමින් සිදු කරන මේ කතාවට TV1 නාලිකාව ඔස්සේ අඛණ්ඩව සමන් දෙන්නට අපි සූදානම් තවත් තොරතුරු සමගින් ඉදිරියේදී ඔබව හමුවන්නට. ශක්ති.
நன்றி மேஷ். கேபிட்டல் மகாராஜா குழுமத்தின் வருடாந்த மாநாட்டில் தென்னாப்பிரிக்காவின் முன்னாள் ஜனாதிபதி தாபோ உம்பேக்கி சிறப்புரையாற்றிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றார். இதனை TV1 தொலைக்காட்சியினூடாக நேரலையாக உங்களால் பார்வையிட முடியும். இதனைத் தொடர்ந்து இடம்பெறும் தகவல்களை உங்களுக்கு வழங்குவதற்காக நாங்கள் காத்துக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். ஹஷின்.
Yes, Anesta, we are now witnessing the keynote address by the distinguished chief guest of the 45th Annual Convention of the Capital Maharaja Group, the iconic former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. We will now take on the keynote address to TV1, so stay tuned for the latest updates.
இதனைத் தொடர்ந்து இடம்பெறும் தகவல்களை உங்களுக்கு வழங்குவதற்காக நாங்கள் காத்துக்கொண்டே இருக்கின்றோம். ஹஷினி.
Yes, Anesta, we are now witnessing the keynote address by the distinguished chief guest of the 45th annual convention of the Capital Maharaja Group, the iconic former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. We will now take on the keynote address to TV1, so stay tuned for the latest updates.
And also I must say that I was very, very happy that we had an occasion here to listen to this presentation about the group, CMG. Bearing in mind the challenges, the economic challenges that the country faces, that Sri Lanka faces, and listen to what CMG is doing, because it's a major player in terms of responding to the economic challenges of this country. And really, I want to say congratulations to the company, congratulations to the CEO, and all of the leaders of the company for what you are doing, because clearly it's important that Sri Lanka should achieve the high and sustained economic growth rates that it needs. And in order to generate the resources that are needed to improve the lives of the people, including and especially the most vulnerable and marginalized sections of the society. Very, very well done indeed, and as I've said, we will be back on your centenary, whether you like it or not, because we have to say very, very well done for over these 100 years. Your letter, Chairperson, said I should come as chief guest and keynote speaker. I didn't quite know you didn't describe what would happen. So I didn't quite know what this would mean, being a chief guest and a keynote speaker. But I think what Shivan Daniel said just now, I think has explained, and what we were told yesterday and today by the Sri Lankans that we've met, including the president, I think I understand, Chairperson, what a chief guest is. The keynote speaker is something else, but the chief guest I understand. I'm aware, Chairperson, that for at least the last 12 years, there's been an agreement between Sri Lanka and South Africa to share experiences in important issues of nation building and reconciliation. And indeed, various activities have taken place with regard to those issues. And so in that context, I must mention that, as you would know, we have tried to follow developments in the sister republic of Sri Lanka from a distance, and in particular throughout the 26 years of the Civil War. Those of us in the South African Liberation Movement fighting to defeat the apartheid crime against humanity have always hoped and prayed that the people of this country would find the possibility to end that conflict by negotiating a just settlement. It's always been in our minds, Chairperson, as we're struggling to defeat our own enemy there, that hopefully the sister people of Sri Lanka would solve this problem among themselves. And conscious of and informed by our own challenges, we also knew, Chairperson, that the silencing of the guns here in Sri Lanka would have to be followed by a very serious and critically important process of national reconciliation and nation building. It was inevitable. It was as inevitable in Sri Lanka as it was inevitable in South Africa. And in this context, I was very, very encouraged to read the speech delivered by the Foreign Affairs Minister of this country, the Honorable Vijita Herat, in February this year, which I'm sure all of us are familiar with, during the 58th regular session of United Nations Human Rights Council. And this is part of what he said, as you know. This is Minister Herat, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He said the government of Sri Lanka is firmly and sincerely committed to working towards a unified Sri Lanka that respects and celebrates the diversity of its people with no division or discrimination based on race, religion, class, and caste. We will leave room for a resurgence of, we will not leave room for the resurgence of divisive racism or religious extremism in our country. Every citizen should feel free to practice their religion, speak their language, and live according to their cultural values without fear of discrimination. And no one should feel that their beliefs, culture, or political affiliations will make them targets of undue pressure or prejudice. And he said the government has pledged to take tangible steps in the interest of further advancing national unity and reconciliation, and strengthening the work towards a Truth and Reconciliation Commission empowered to investigate acts of violence caused by racism and religious extremism that give rise to tensions within Sri Lankan society, unquote. Chairperson, I was very, very glad. I was very, very glad indeed to read these words, because they constitute a commitment towards a new Sri Lanka, no different from the commitment we made about the new South Africa we sought to build after the defeat of the apartheid regime and system. I will therefore make some remarks about what we did to honor the promise we made to ourselves in the same way that Minister Herod had made a promise, hoping that this may serve to encourage you, the sister people of Sri Lanka, as you walk the challenging road towards the realization of the dream expressed by the Honorable Minister. But of course, I'm aware that we do not say what we did necessarily can be replicated in Sri Lanka, as the conditions, the histories, and other factors differ between our two countries. However, I think in principle, the challenge you face is the same challenge that we face. So to that extent, we're brothers and sisters in the common trench. So I'm making these remarks bearing in mind that commonality. And in any case, Chairperson, in terms of what I'm trying to say, that what happened in South Africa cannot necessarily be replicated here, is that I must confess that regrettably, my knowledge of Sri Lanka is too shallow for me to make any proposal or suggestion on the basis of an arrogant belief that anything we did in South Africa could be implemented here. The South Africa I speak about, Chairperson, had experienced 300, by the time we got our liberation in 1994, the country had experienced 350 years of colonial white minority domination. And during this period, it had developed as a multiracial, multilingual, multicultural country of gross inequalities and immense suffering for the majority of the population. And during a protracted struggle for national liberation, the forces of colonialism and apartheid had engaged in extreme repression against the majority, the oppressed majority, in a vain effort to defeat the national liberation movement. Accordingly, when liberation from white political domination came to an end in 1994, democratic South Africa inherited not only a deeply divided and polarized society, but one with sharp and entrenched animosities. However, this very same society, with all of those animosities, was composed of people who had to learn to live together, to accept the need for peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial cooperation, inspired by a common patriotism. In 1996, 2 years after liberation, when a census was conducted, the South African population stood at just about 41 million people. Of these, just over 5 million were white people, constituting almost 11% of the population. And so you can see, colleagues, that here we were therefore dealing with a sizable part of the South African population. 5 million people is not a small number. But to give an example of the disastrous consequences of settler colonialism, which democratic South Africa had to address, I will mention only one element concerning the important issue of inequality. And there is universal agreement that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. And for example, when the Gini coefficient in South Africa stood at 63, it was 53 in Brazil, 41 in the US, and lowest in Ukraine, emerging out of the Soviet Union, at 25. So South Africa holds the record with regard to this issue of inequality. It's a result of the settler colonial system, which put the settler population up there and the oppressed population down there. That's why you find this extreme level of inequality, which persists up to this day. In this situation, for instance, the top 10% of wealth holders in the country, who are almost exclusively white, even to this day, they own 86% of the wealth of the country. That's 10%. So you can imagine that the 90% must then own the rest. It's the level of inequality that exists, the animosities that creates, but nevertheless, with all of that reality, coming out of that liberation struggle, we said, we have to live together, and therefore got to find a way of overcoming these animosities and defeating these negative consequences of these 3.5 centuries of colonial domination. And so, as I've said, Chairperson, the South Africans, we had to learn to live together, to accept the need for peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial cooperation, inspired by common patriotism. And to emphasize and underline exactly this reality. Our Constitution, negotiated by all our people, says, and I quote, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity." This concept of South Africa, black and white, belonging to South Africa, belonging to all of who live in it, black and white. The ANC put forward that notion in 1955. And there was opposition from within the liberation movement about that. People are arguing, how can you say us, the colonized, and the settlers who colonized us, coming from Europe, belong together in one country? But we insisted, Chairperson, that no, yes indeed, that history is correct, but the reality is that in order to take a step forward, we cannot adopt the positions that our oppressors have taken of racism. We are saying together they've become the settlers, they become South African. And therefore this South Africa must belong to them as it belongs to the rest of us. So I'm saying the Constitution of South Africa of today says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. And that same section of our Constitution, Chairperson, the preamble, where this sentence occurs, also makes other important observations which are very relevant to the imperative to eradicate the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. And it says, we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past honor those who have suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. All of us, Chairperson, agreed that conditions had to be created to make it possible to realize this aspiration of a South Africa that would truly belong to all who live in it, united in their diversity. It wouldn't come on its own. And so before I examine this matter further, let me also state that what was an important part of the approach of the liberation movement to the negotiated termination of white apartheid minority domination. This was that such a process should be of ending that white minority domination should be as inclusive as possible, enabling the participation of the largest possible number of people or representatives of these people. It was on that basis that our movement agreed that the Constitution, which would be negotiated and adopted by an elected constituent body, assembly, should be bound by a set of constitutional principles that would have been negotiated prior to the formulation of the Constitution. Negotiated among a very inclusive group, including the white minority settler group, to negotiate the principles, constitutional principles, that would be binding on the Constitution that would be negotiated by an elected assembly. I'm saying this was to make sure that this process of transition is as inclusive as possible, because its very, very success dependent on that inclusivity. So to return to the matter of creating a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, one of the critical points that was agreed was that because of the extreme, pervasive, and sustained violence visited against the people by the apartheid regime as it sought to perpetuate a crime against humanity, it was imperative that the road to a shared South Africa we have mentioned must include two signposts of both peace and justice. As this esteemed convention knows, the very, very first democratic election in South Africa took place in 1994. To enable this to take place within a constitutional framework, a negotiated interim constitution was adopted in 1993. And this constitution contains an important section which was described as its epilogue. And that epilogue is entitled National Unity and Reconciliation, describing what would be a giant step forward in the process to extricate our country from the colonial and apartheid legacy. That epilogue says that this constitution provides a historic bridge between the past of a deeply divided society characterized by strife, conflict, untold suffering and injustice, and a future founded on the recognition of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence, and development opportunities for all South Africans, irrespective of color, race, class, belief, or sex. And it says the pursuit of national unity, the well-being of all South African citizens, and peace require reconciliation between the people of South Africa and the reconstruction of society. And says the adoption of this constitution lays the secure foundation for the people of South Africa to transcend the divisions and strife of the past, which generated gross violations of human rights, transgression of humanitarian principles, in violent conflicts, and a legacy of hatred, fear, guilt, and revenge. These can now be addressed on the basis, says the Constitution, that there is a need for understanding, but not for vengeance, a need for reparation, but not retaliation. A need for Ubuntu, but not victimization, unquote. And to give effect to these constitutional injunctions, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, the Parliament elected in 1994 adopted the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act in 1995. And among other things, that law says that since the Constitution of the Republic of South, the 1993 Constitution of the Republic provided a historic bridge between the past of a deeply divided society and the future founded on the recognition of human rights. And since it is deemed necessary to establish the truth in relation to past events, as well as motives for and circumstances in which gross violations of human rights occurred, and to make the findings known in order to prevent a repetition of such acts in future. And since the Constitution states that the pursuit of national unity, the well-being of all South African citizens, and peace require reconciliation between the people of South Africa and the reconstruction of society. And since the Constitution states that in order to advance such reconciliation and reconstruction, amnesty shall be granted in respect of acts, omissions, and offenses associated with political objectives committed in the course of the conflicts of the past. And it said, this is therefore enacted by the Parliament of South Africa as follows, that it is hereby established a juristic person known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that act said the trial shall achieve its objectives in part by establishing as complete a picture as possible of the causes, the nature, and extent of the gross violations of human rights which were committed during the period from the 1st of March 1960 to the cut-off date, including the antecedents, the circumstances, factors, and context of such violations, as well as the perspectives of the victims and the motives and perspectives of the persons responsible for the commission of the violations, by conducting investigations and holding hearings. And said that that commission should also work by establishing and making known the fate or whereabouts of victims, and by restoring the human civil dignity of such victims, by granting them an opportunity to relate their own accounts of the violations of which they are the victims, and by recommending reparation measures in respect of what they had suffered. And beyond this, unquote, and beyond these provisions, Chairperson, through its amnesty committee, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, had the legal right to deny amnesty to those who, in their request for amnesty, had not told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And indeed, hundreds of the former functionaries of the apartheid regime were denied amnesty. The TRC then referred these to the National Prosecuting Authority, requesting the authority to investigate and prosecute these, if indeed they had the case to answer. And as I said earlier, it was agreed during the process of the negotiations to end white minority domination that, among others, the two vital matters, related matters, of peace and justice had to be addressed. And there was therefore insistence that the matter of justice should not be avoided, and that reconciliation was not possible without justice. And so, to summarize what I've tried to convey so far, to begin the process in South Africa of liberating our country and people from the pernicious legacy of colonialism and apartheid, it was agreed that one, post-apartheid South Africa must work for genuine national unity and reconciliation, respecting the principle and practice of unity in diversity. And two, to achieve this, the process to effect the transition from apartheid to democracy must be as inclusive as possible. And three, that this transition must, among others, address the two challenges of peace and justice. And one of the instruments to help facilitate the achievement of national unity and reconciliation must be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which must, one, work to ensure that the truth is told about the gross violation of human rights during the course of the political conflict in our country. That the Commission must include all necessary details, including providing information about those who had disappeared while in the hands of the operatives of the apartheid states. Give amnesty, provide for amnesty, truthfully providing full information about the gross human rights violations to which they were confessing. That Commission also had to recommend the prosecution of those denied amnesty. It had to recommend reparations for the victims of the gross human rights violations, and otherwise recommend what else should be done to advance the cause of national unity and reconciliation, including building monuments and identifying heritage sites, and so on. In addition to all of this, and of the greatest importance, structural changes would have to be effected to eradicate the legacy of colonialism, apartheid, represented, among others, for instance, by the gross racial inequality of wealth and income, which I have mentioned. In other words, Chairperson, there was no misconception that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on its own would bring about the required national unity and reconciliation. Rather, the TRC was a necessary but insufficient part of the process to achieve the country's national unity and reconciliation. And one of the political parties in South Africa went to court to challenge the Truth and Reconciliation Act, which established a commission that I've discussed earlier. And so before I conclude, Chairperson, with your indulgence, I would like to quote important words uttered by the then president of our Constitutional Court when delivering the judgment in that case, the case which challenged the legality of the Truth and Reconciliation Act. Though delivered 29 years ago, I feel that as one listens to the words delivered by the judge, one discovers or is exposed to the intense feeling that gripped millions of our people as they awaited the TRC process. Very keen, as though this were a matter of life and death, that finally the truth would be told about the immense suffering to which they had been subjected. And so just spoke Justice Ismail Mohammed. And he said, much of what transpired in this shameful apartheid period is shrouded in secrecy and not easily capable of objective demonstration and proof. Loved ones have disappeared, sometimes mysteriously, and most of them no longer survive to tell their tales. Others have had their freedom invaded, their dignity assaulted, or their reputations tarnished by grossly unfair imputations held in the fire and crossfire of a deep and wounding conflict. The wicked and the innocent have often been, both of them, victims. Secrecy and authoritarianism have concealed the truth in little crevices of obscurity in our history. The records are not easily accessible. Witnesses are often unknown, dead, or unavailable, or unwilling. And all that often effectively remains is the truth of wounded memories of loved ones, sharing instinctive suspicions, deep and traumatizing to the survivors, but otherwise incapable of translating themselves into objective and corroborative evidence which could survive the rigors of the law. And the judge said the Act, the Truth and Reconciliation Act, seeks to address this massive problem by encouraging these survivors and dependents of the tortured and wounded, the maimed and the dead, to unburden their grief publicly, to receive the collective recognition of a new nation that they have wronged, and crucially to help them to discover what did in truth happen to their loved ones, where and under what circumstances it did happen, and who was responsible. That truth which the victims of repression seek so desperately to know is, in these circumstances, much more likely to be forthcoming if those responsible for such monstrous misdeeds are encouraged to disclose the whole truth, with the incentive that they will not receive the punishment which they undoubtedly deserve if they do. Without that incentive, there is nothing to encourage such persons to make the disclosures and to reveal the truth which persons in the positions of the applicants so desperately desire. Excuse me, the families of those unlawfully tortured, maimed or traumatized become more empowered to discover the truth. The perpetrators become exposed to opportunities to obtain relief from the burden of guilt or an anxiety which might be living with them for many long years. And the country begins a long and necessary process of healing the wounds of the past. And Justice Mohammed said the alternative to the granting of immunity from criminal prosecution of offenders is to continue to keep the dependents of such victims, in many cases substantially ignorant about what precisely happened to their loved ones, to leave their yearning for the truth effectively unassuaged, to perpetuate their legitimate sense of resentment and grief, and correspondingly to allow the culprits of such deeds to remain perhaps physically free, but inhibited in their capacity to become active, full and creative society of the new order by a menacing combination of confused fear, guilt, uncertainty, and sometimes even trepidation, unquote. So, Chairperson, during the years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had completed its work, our economy achieved rates of economic growth which the country had last experienced 50 years earlier. Thus, it became possible to reduce the numbers of the unemployed, as well as reduce the poverty levels. And for the very, very first time since the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, we were able to generate budget surpluses, making it possible for the government both to invest in the economy as well as strengthen the social security net to help the poorest in our country. I have no doubt, Chairperson, that the TRC made an important contribution, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made an important contribution in terms of helping to create the atmosphere in the country which made it possible to register these important economic advances. And so, Chairperson and dear friends, I come back to what the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of this country, Vijita Herad, said when he addressed UN Human Rights Council 4 months ago, that the government of Sri Lanka is firmly and sincerely committed to working towards a unified Sri Lanka that respects and celebrates the diversity of its people with no division or discrimination based on race, religion, class, or caste, and will not leave room for a resurgence of divisive racism and religious extremism in our country. The government has pledged to take tangible steps in the interest of further advancing national unity and reconciliation and strengthening the work towards a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, empowered to investigate acts of violence caused by racism and religious extremism that give rise to tensions within Sri Lankan society, unquote. I'm honored, Chairperson and friends, to pledge our full support to the esteemed President and Government of Sri Lanka as they pursue these noble objectives. as well as to convey my sincere wish to you and the rest of the sister people of this republic that we join hands with you to achieve the historic objectives explained by Minister Herath. And I'd also like to assure you, Chairperson, and all of you, that South Africa will do its best to share its experiences with the government and people of Sri Lanka on the vitally important matter of national unity and reconciliation. And I thank you very much for your attention.